Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to another episode of the Coach Cody podcast. Today, I have a special guest who happens to be my coach and mentor, Austin Stout. So, welcome, Austin. If you want to give us a little brief intro about yourself and how you kind of, got to be the gut health expert that you are.
So, I do a lot of gut health podcasts, so I would like to first say that I do more than gut health, so we could yeah, I get asked to do so many gut health podcasts, which is fine, nothing wrong with that, but for anyone that cares, I do everything, a little bit of everything, or a lot of everything. But I have been coaching for the end of this year will be about 15 years in this space. So this is essentially all I've ever done in my adult life, other than
That's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, other than some little odds and ends part-time jobs I had as a teenager, just to make some extra income. But I was a wrestler in high school, and I became interested in nutrition through that primarily. I gravitated towards competitive bodybuilding from there, just because a lot of the information that I was finding really was coming from bodybuilding sources at the time. So of course I'm dating this a little bit because we're talking like magazines and forums essentially. So this is pre-Instagram, right? Probably, I don't know when YouTube came around, but I didn't really utilize YouTube at all. But most of it, again, I kind of grew up in the forums and learned as much as I could from there. And in hindsight, a lot of that information was wild, just because of what we know now. But I feel that I'm fortunate to have that background of kind of the more anecdotal evidence background, where we didn't really have a lot of science. And it was a lot of like trial and error and just seeing what worked,
Yeah.
So I do kind of bridge that gap between the older crowd and of course what we have now, which is we have a lot more data, a lot more information, and there's just a lot more people doing it, right? So I started in that space as a personal trainer in a gym, right? So back then, that's basically how everyone started, because basically nobody was coaching online. there was very few, and I only really knew of a couple people that were doing it. And to my knowledge, I don't know of anyone, and I'm probably wrong because there probably was somebody, but I don't really know anyone that was doing that as their full-time job. And we're talking like I think my first paid client was in 2009.
Okay.
So there probably was, like, there definitely probably was someone, but I don't know who, right? There were a lot of people kind of dabbling and helping people part-time, and they had, full-time jobs on the side. And so I slowly, as I was, doing a lot of the in-person training, I slowly phased more and more into the side of nutrition. I was actually going to school as a nutrition major at the time, so I was in college. I do have a bachelor's degree in nutrition, and there was a point in there somewhere where I thought, okay, this could actually be a viable career. And I wasn't going to school for nutrition then. I was still kind of in the prerequisite phase. I was like in the health prerequisites, because I was deciding between either like physical therapy or something in that realm. And they had actually just changed the graduation requirements from a master's degree to a PhD, I think is what happened. And I'm like, nah, I'm not doing that. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not going to go to school for 8 years and be $200,000 in debt for this job that I really am not that passionate about, and maybe won't even have a lucrative career at. Not that at the time I didn't have any money anyhow, so I was already broke. So I figured, okay, I'm going to keep going to school, but I'm going to switch my major over to nutrition, and that's going to help, facilitate my business more. Of course, there was a lot of my parents or anyone that was around was like, what is this? Like, this is not a thing, like nobody's doing this. But of course it did grow. I was probably not doing any more in-person training by about 2011. End of 2011, I was pretty much just full-time online. I maybe had 20 clients but also rent back then was like $500 a month, so keep that in mind.
Yeah.
Right, so I was skating by, I was doing $50 a week in food, bodybuilding, like we're talking like bulk rice, bags of potatoes, like bulk chicken, maybe the vegetables that I could afford at the time. I was actively competing throughout that time period. So I did my first show in 2009. As a teenager, I turned 18 in 2008, because I was born in 90. So I turned 18 in 2008. I was still technically, I wasn't even 19 yet. It was before I had turned 19, so I competed at 18 years old, and then again in 10, 11, and 12. That is actually, funny thing is, like, that's actually what led me into functional health more, because I completely wiped out all my hormones in that time, right? So then I was running into hormone issues, adrenal issues, like all these things, and I think what happened was, as I learned more about that, and I was fortunate to have a doctor that's very, very knowledgeable in that space, somebody that I still see today. He kind of turned me on to a lot of this stuff, and what I realizing was like, okay, well, these are symptoms and patterns that I'm seeing with my own clients. Like, this can't be just a me thing. And of course, I took what knowledge I had at the time and started implementing some of these strategies and learning about stress management and all this, and that just grew and evolved until we got to where we are today, which is, of course, much more complex and deep and elaborate, with specialized testing and all kinds of different stuff that we have access to now. But yeah, and then of course I started mentoring people around 2017, I think, roughly, which was literally just somebody asking me to help them learn about this stuff, and they said they would pay me, and I'm like, okay. I didn't have any, there was like no education, like I had no material, no nothing, and I just started kind of accumulating that. And of course it's grown to be, I always joke now that like a lot of this stuff comes back to me somewhere. So,
yeah, that's awesome. I mean, you paved your own path. So before there was training software and everyone was looking to coach online. So that's awesome. So as far as like gut health goes specifically, I know you had experiences with like your own stuff, you're figuring out stuff for yourself. So what kind of got you into being able to, help your clients with it? And like, what's some of the most prevalent things you see, are like the most common issues that people deal with, and how do you approach that?
So the first thing, I was introduced to it a little bit differently than some people, because I work with a lot of general population people, but I also worked with probably 50% competitors, because that's what I was, right? And what I am. So what I was seeing was two things. One is that I'm having these off-season bodybuilders that are not making progress because they can't eat anymore, right?
Yeah.
Like bloating, gas, acid reflux. In more severe cases, some of these individuals, as I got more advanced and got bigger clients, like, were having, IBD and Crohn's disease and like all these things. And I'm like, okay, well, is this a thing? Like, is this just how it is? And are we limited by these factors as terms of like, we can't just grow anymore, Yeah. And then in my general population clients, of course, getting a lot of the very high stress, yo-yo dieting backgrounds. Then I started learning more about the effects of that on hormones, and then, drop some birth control into that equation. And I think that the first and biggest thing that I really started to understand, because I was having a lot of my own, what I would call more adrenal related issues, was how stress tied into that piece. And now we beat this topic to death every single day, and people just get tired of hearing about it. But the thing about stress is that every single one of these cases has a stress component to it. How we quantify that can be difficult, because we have all of these different inputs that could technically qualify as stress, whether it's environmental or training or whatever it is. I kind of joke with people sometimes about why they think they might be special compared to someone that doesn't train, because like you have all of these life stressors plus you beat the shit out of yourself all the time. So like, you know, you're kind of physiologically, you kind of have the same defense mechanisms as anyone else, right? Now granted, you probably eat better food, you probably prioritize sleep a little bit more, so like those things put you at an advantage, but you have all of this other stress input on your nervous system and on your adrenal glands and on your digestive tract from weight training very intensely, you know, like outside of the Gen Pop. And even some of the Gen Pop people, maybe it's not as intense, but it's just the sheer amount that they're doing. You know, they're training 6-7 days a week, they're doing cardio, you know, they're doing 20,000 steps a day, like these ridiculous things that we see, and they have, you know, 2 jobs, they work night shifts, they got all this, you know, all this stuff going on. So I mean, that's always a component with everyone. It is. That's never going to change. I think that the other, you know, the other most prominent thing that, and this might seem really basic and kind of silly, but we in the fitness space, and this has gotten better, but we kind of created a lot of our own issues by really boxing ourselves in with food, right? So you mean, you work with me, you know, like I like diversity and nutrition, and we really like everything basically was derived from the idea of eat these same 5 foods all the time because they're clean, whatever, you can put condiments on them and seasonings and stuff, but you're basically still eating chicken and maybe some beef and maybe some fish perhaps. You've got, and it's funny because even vegetable selection, it was like there was actually only a few of those, right? Like, why are we not eating this other stuff, right? Because we, as a child, you were kind of, if you were introduced to the idea of fruit and vegetables, you would go into a supermarket or grocery store and you pretty much knew that everything in this section is healthy, quote unquote. So why, as bodybuilders, are we like, well, we're going to eat these 3, you know? And of course, when we're talking about our bigger bodybuilders and our off season and our high food amounts, those are the first things to go because food volume goes up and there's no room in your stomach for any of that anymore. Or on the flip side of that, you're eating super low calories, so you're completely destroying your GI tract with volume, right? Because you're eating 3 pounds of broccoli at every meal or something ridiculous. Like all of us have probably done some dumb shit like that before. And probably will again if we have to. But you know, those things come with the territory sometimes. So I think that aside from stress, the food variety thing, and you can get into more specifics, like certain things may have some other benefits, but really that has been a huge game changer for a lot of people, is just not only from a GI perspective, but also just from like a life perspective, like this idea that there are more things available to you, right? Like that's game changing. I mean, you're basically going from this, what is a really disordered eating pattern, to this idea that we have this massive selection of things that we could potentially choose from that are beneficial.
And as far as like diversity goes, I guess how would you define that exactly? Because I know, you know, for me, basically, you know, I like to keep things simple and not like same thing all the time, but I feel like a lot of people get decision fatigue, and they when there's too much, they're just like freak out and then don't know what to do and malfunction, and they're just like, I can't do it. So I guess like what would be like a standard diversity kind of way of eating in your mind?
So like practically, like how do you program that, you know? And so we really have kind of 2 major models that we utilize for nutrition, and there's obviously like subsets of this and nuances, but you're either probably going to be on a set meal plan or you're going to be on a macro plan. And then you're going to have some kind of variation, like depending on what your coach likes or whatever your situation is, you're going to be somewhere in those 2 categories probably. And when it comes to macro planning, of course, the idea of it's really enticing because you have this freedom for variety, but a lot of people actually get a ton of decision fatigue, like you said, when you're talking about that stuff, if they're trying to get too fancy with it or trying to do too much. So what do? They pretty much just end up eating the same shit because it's just convenient. And like, these are the things that I like, right? So it's just, I think that a macro plan a lot of the time ends up being basically just like a set meal plan anyhow for people. And then the set meal plan, of course, takes away some of the extra thought that you have to put in that process. And a lot of people prefer it. You know, they prefer that idea that they just can just do what it says and they don't have to think about anything. And that's nice for a lot of people. And I can understand that. Now, in either of those situations, variety doesn't need to be, it's going to be person dependent in terms of how much you want to do it. It's personal preference, but also, you don't have to eat different stuff every day. However, you could maybe have variety programmed within your day-to-day, even though it's similar stuff day-to-day. So for example, you are generally eating this list of foods, but are we meeting some basic requirements? Like, what are those requirements? Proteins, that's relatively simple because you're going to get a lot of the same micronutrients from animal-based protein sources a lot of the time anyhow. Like, you could argue beef probably has a little more iron and B vitamins and stuff, but for the amount of protein that we're eating, unless you have a nutrient deficiency, you're going to select like 3 things. Done. You can maybe like throw eggs in there or something because those do have some different nutrients. That's fine. Maybe a whey isolate or something if you need that. Carbohydrate sources, again, not that complicated because like if you're looking at starchy carbs, I mean, what are you doing? I mean, rice-based, potato-based, maybe like oats or something. You know, and you can have some variations of those if you want to get fancy with it, but there's not going to be a whole lot of variance in there. Now, I will say with starches, I do like to vary that. So I am a fan of using, of course, rice-based sources. Basically, everyone tolerates those, and they're easy and they're cheap. But I do like having some potentially some potato-based carbs in there too, for maybe some like resistant starch. That's good for feeding some commensal bacteria or good bacteria in the gut. Oats as well. The fibers in there specifically can help feed some good gut microbiome. So like if you can tolerate those things and you have the calories to a lot, definitely, use the variance. Fat sources, while fat sources might not feed microbiome in the same way that a carbohydrate does, there's still a lot of variance in there. You basically have like monounsaturated fats, which are like oils, avocado oil, olive oil, mostly animal-based proteins that'll probably have higher saturated fats, like meats, eggs, things like that. And then you might have some in between that have like some polyunsaturated, which we're not doing too heavily, but like nuts, maybe so like avocado in there perhaps, each of those is still important because they do provide different micronutrients and they do provide different fatty acid profiles to help control inflammation and help with basically contributing cholesterol and building tissues, for like creating molecules in the body. Fruits and veggies are where things that's where a lot of the variety should come into play. Now, in an ideal world, if you liked everything, then I would probably say a great rule of thumb would probably be to have a minimum of 3 types of fruit and 3 types of veggie in a day. And that's just like a very, very general, broad suggestion. But that's not to say that you can't do more. And if you don't like those things that much, you can get creative with it. So like doing smoothies. Hey, if you don't like a lot of stuff, everyone probably likes a good tasting smoothie. Blend that stuff up.
Yeah.
Right. I can pretty much stack half of my day right there in a smoothie. and then I don't have to put much thought into it later. Like, I don't know how many people like eating kale. Shit's gross. But I could put a little bit of kale or spinach into a fruit smoothie, and I'm not, other than turning it green, probably not going to taste it, right?
Yeah,
and
for sure.
There you go. But I would also go as far as to say that I kind of start to preference fruit a little bit more than veggie in a lot of cases, just because, one, they do tend to be a little bit easier to digest for most people because of the fiber composition that they have. They're probably a little bit higher in micronutrients in general, like they have more polyphenols, more antioxidants, things like that. Not to say that you should neglect green veggie, but a lot of people will notice in my plans that I have like maybe a little more bias towards the fruits, and we try to use colors, so we're looking at some blues and some reds, and maybe some yellows would be like a banana, something like that, but berries. And you can go way outside the box on this. I mean, it's funny, like I've created plans for people sometimes, and they're like, I'm gonna eat kiwis, and I'm gonna eat apples, and I'm gonna eat oranges, and I'm gonna eat grapes, and they're like, what is that? I'm like, but why not?
Exactly.
Yeah. Like, what is going to happen to you? Why are you concerned? So I do encourage people to just explore that variety. Especially, it gets a little harder when you're a bodybuilder, of course, and you're getting deep into the low calorie territory. Like, yeah, I'm probably going to preference blueberries over bananas because I can get way more blueberries than I can get bananas. So fair, totally fair. But outside of like select instances where the food volume is super limited, then diversify where you can.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I think, so let's talk about IBS, I guess we could say, because I feel like a lot of the people that I've worked with, or just in general, a lot of people are like, I have IBS, which I feel like is usually a diagnosis from doctors that's just like, I don't fucking know, like, here, you have irritable bowel, I don't know what else to tell you. So like, in your perspective, what are some realities of what IBS might actually be, and like what are some things that you do for it?
So if we look at this from the idea of diagnoses, and we're not doctors, so we're not going to diagnose people with things necessarily, but when we talk about digestion issues and Western medicine, for one, there's not really testing for most things. So there's that. About the extent that you're probably going to get is if you had some acute food poisoning or something, and you're like vomiting all the time, or you have like persistent diarrhea or something, they might run a stool test on you to make sure you don't have like E. coli or C. diff or something like that. Maybe once in a while you'll get a test for H. pylori, and if you really badger them to death, you might get a GI doctor that does like a SIBO breath test or something. But in general, you're going to go to the doctor, they're going to tell you that you have IBS, which irritable bowel syndrome, but like, why is it irritable? Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Or you're going to go to the doctor and you're going to have acid reflux or something like that, and they're going to be like, well, here's a proton pump inhibitor that'll mask your symptoms for a while until you need to come back and we'll give you more or something stronger. So if we're thinking about like a general IBS diagnosis, so let's say the criteria for that might be like bloating, gas, maybe urgency of stools, like feeling like you need to really go, or it could be constant on the other end of the spectrum, it could be like constipation. So what areas could cause these symptoms? One is we have bacteria, so we can have bacterial imbalances, like that's something we look at, in like GI maps and things. Two, we can have bacterial pathogens or like infectious pathogens. So those would be things that would cause like acute reactions. So like E. coli, C. diff, like food poisoning, something like that. These pathogens can also be implicated in other infections like UTIs, like urinary tract infections and things like that. 3, we could have fungal infections. So we could have, that could be various types of funguses, yeast, candida, things of that nature. In some cases, we could have an H. pylori infection, which is another pathogen that's relatively common. Maybe a parasitic infection, like that is a possibility. That's not one, like some people talk about that more than others, but that could happen. And then the other, and probably one that's maybe not as related to bacteria, would just be you have some massive inflammatory issue that's probably causing lower intestinal inflammation. So that would be more like IBD, so like inflammatory bowel disease. So that would be kind of like Crohn's, colitis, diverticulitis, somewhere in that cluster of issues. So I mean, those are the main areas that would cause IBD or IBS. Now, the first thing we're going to obviously want to do is, I think a lot of people like to jump right to like, okay, so we can test for it, we can look at what bacteria you have and stuff, because like we have access to like GI maps and things now. But like stress, sleep, food selection, I mean, I can't even tell you how many times that I've literally just gone into someone's diet and like just diversified. Like I said, I know it's kind of going to be a catchword for the podcast, but I've just improved food selection, and like, man, I feel a lot better. I'm like, okay, yeah, because, well, what we're doing now is we're diversifying your microbiome, because you're feeding more different types of strands of bacteria. And because the longer you stay, I mean, basically what happens is the longer you stay on these restrictive diets, whether it's eating the same 5 foods or you're doing maybe some kind of like specialized diet that could be like carnivore, keto, or low FODMAP or whatever, they will have a really profound effect on the diversity of your microbiome. So in a short term, maybe not a problem. Now long term, that could potentially, I'm not saying always, but it could potentially present some issues with people, just because basically if they eat anything else outside of what they're used to digesting, they're going to have a problem, or they're going to maybe come up with some food intolerances just because they're over consuming these foods continuously. So for example, like if you ate, like let's say we took your diet right now, let's say like we've got these fruits and veggies and these proteins, and then I told you I told you next week, like, hey, we're going to do a ketogenic diet for 2 weeks, and you did it. We wouldn't do that, but let's say we did. If we were to actually test that, if we were to actually do like a GI map from start to finish, you would know that even in 2 weeks, like you would see a difference in your microbiome composition from doing that diet because of how drastic the differences in food. So is that bad? I mean, it's not directly bad, but I always think it's funny because when you look at, like, people ask me these questions all the time, like, hey, I saw this study that such and such changes your microbiome. Like, well, everything, like literally everything changes the bacterial composition, and that's kind of been the argument with things like artificial sweeteners or these types of foods or this and that. It's like literally everything you put in will have an acute effect, right? It's just how much of that before it becomes a problem, and like how long are you doing it? Yeah. So that would be like if you ate a really good diet and then you went and had a large pizza, yeah, you're probably going to have a stomach ache and you're probably going to have to go to the bathroom. Does that mean you have a gut issue? No. It just means that you probably ought to get back to eating the good stuff again, so you can regulate. Yeah. So
Yeah. I think one of the things that you always say that always resonates with me that a lot of people don't think about is, you always focus on how someone's body is functioning before anything. Because it's like, how do you expect to like make progress if your digestion is shit? Like basically focusing on health before going into building phases and stuff like that. So yeah, like what was your, what brought you to that? Is it just like trial and error over the years? You just realize like, oh, if we don't fix this and we just skip all these steps, we're not going to get anywhere anyways. And then like, how do you get people to participate in that? 'Cause everyone wants something like as quick as possible. So how do you slow people down and be like, hey, look, we got to fix these digestive issues first?
Yeah, the first thing to realize there is that everyone's resilience to things is different. So there's a lot of like, I can't even tell you how many IFBB pros there are probably walking around that have pretty rough digestion that still look really, really good, right?
Yeah.
So there's obviously a genetic component to that, and maybe their resilience to some of those things are a little bit better than yours or mine. But could they look even better? Like, could they get even better results if they function better? So the way that I realized that was actually in reverse order. It wasn't like, I'm going to fix these things so we can get better results. It's like, I saw that they got better results once we fixed them. So I'm like, okay, well, it only made sense to me that we try to prioritize those things as much as we can, not only prior, but during whatever, growth phase or contest prep or whatever it might be. And then also I understood too that the further, like the more extreme the goal was, the more we were probably going to screw it up again and have to fix it again. And that's just kind of the reality when you're talking about bigger goals like contest prep or gaining a lot of muscle, like something that's way above and beyond what your average gym goer is going to want to achieve, so like, yeah, you're going to mess it up to some extent, but try to mess it up minimally would be the idea. And it's, getting buy-in with that, it can be really easy sometimes, and other times it can be very difficult. And a lot of that just depends on, I think a lot of it depends on the client's level of course, their willingness, but I think a lot of the willingness comes from the fact that they just get sick of not getting a result.
Yeah.
And eventually they're listening. So like, and that kind of is with any functional health issue, it's kind of like, I think you could make a parallel with something like addiction, right? So when you look at it, you could know that something is hurting you, and you could see that something is hurting you, right? You know it. You can see it around you. You can feel the effects of it. But you won't commit to making that change until you hit a low enough point in that process where you're like, I can't do this anymore. So I heard this quote one time that it was something to the effect of, you won't make a change unless the fear or like the pain of the change becomes less than the pain of whatever you have going on at the time, right? Yeah. So like, you have to, once that ratio flips, and for some people that's very low threshold. They're like, yeah, I don't really like what's going on, I want to get better results, I trust you, cool, let's rock. But for other people, they're just not ready. They're just not ready yet. So, and my job is to explain things the best I can, and also give examples. I think giving examples is helpful, because like, if we're just saying, hey, I want to do XYZ and I want to reduce your stress and do all this stuff so you can get better results, they're like, that's hard to really quantify. But if I can give them examples of like, hey, this is stuff I do with my clients, like, hey, maybe go check out so-and-so's Instagram or this or that, or maybe go, talk to them or whatever, and look how much better they did. And I can talk about that stuff online, and I can put that on social media, and I can preach it. And I think that helps get the message across. But even then, even if they know I'm right, it doesn't even matter sometimes. Like they could be like, yeah, you're right, but I still don't want to do it. I'm like, okay, I can't. Like it's so simple. It's as simple as being like 1 + 1 = 2. They say, yeah, I know it does, but I don't care. All right. And the reality is that just some people aren't ready. They maybe aren't ready to do it yet, or you maybe have to just phase them into it slowly. And as coaches, we do sometimes have to compromise what we consider optimal to like start stepping people up, because while they might have all these things going on, I try to put myself in other people's shoes too, because if I were let's say I came into a coach and I had a 10-year history of bodybuilding and I've done like a lot, like everything wrong. The first thing I'm going to realize when the coach kind of relays this information to me, I come to someone that finally knows what they're talking about, and they're kind of, maybe they do some blood work or some testing and they like explain things to me. What's the first realization you have to make? They're like, this is my fault. That sucks.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That sucks. Like how do you, like, what do you do with that? You basically have to swallow that and be like, dude, look at all the results I left on the table potentially, or look what maybe even in more extreme cases where someone's really in trouble health-wise. Like, I have put myself, it's not even competing anymore. It's just like, I want to not feel terrible anymore. And the first thing they have to do is come to the realization that a lot of what they did was maybe, yes, they had bad guidance, but they did it, like that's real tough. And so taking ownership, like once you can take ownership of something and put that ego aside, that's when you can let the process work. Because what's going to happen, and the way that I like to explain it to people is, I'm like, look, you can do this or you can't, or you don't, and that's really your call. Like, we're all adults, but if you don't, this is your trajectory, and if you're okay with that, that's your call. Like, I can't force you to do it, but just realize that your trajectory is not going to get any better if you don't do anything different. If you just continue to beat around the bush or continue to do exactly what you're doing, you're going to get what you always got, but probably worse. Like, these things are compounding, you know what I mean? Like, it's like you start noticing little issues, digestion's starting to slow down a little bit, but all of a sudden, a couple months later, you're like, man, I'm in a really bad spot. And that can get worse and worse and worse until you create some kind of really profound issue. And maybe sometimes they have to get worse before they're ready to go. I try to avoid that, obviously, but I try to let them know, like, this is not what I would do. And also, if you don't want to work with me and you go to any other coach, please be cautious of these things. Like, don't just let somebody take your money just to run you into the ground.
Yeah.
And I hope that my message gets through to them, but that's about all we can do,
Yeah, very true. Yeah, I think so. This is kind of like a little bit off topic, kind of, but so there's the like the functional health kind of space, and then there's like the like evidence based space, whatever that kind of means. But I'm sure basically there's people who tell you that like all these things in like the functional space aren't real or like don't exist. So like, have you come across that? And if so, how do you generally handle that?
I would say that most of those people probably wouldn't come to me in the first place because they probably wouldn't resonate with what I have to say. So
yeah,
I probably don't run into it as much as you might think, just because most people probably won't even talk to me to begin with. And I always say this, like, I don't even consider myself a functional health coach. Like, I just consider myself somebody that does what makes sense. Like, I have experience in both situations, and when you coach, like, some of the things you do are purely intuitive because they're pattern recognition, right? Like, I don't need a study necessarily to recognize a pattern. If I've done something 150 times and I can see it, all right, that's cool. Like I don't need PubMed for that.
Right.
But
well, it's still evidence based if you've got the evidence for it, right?
Right. Yeah, I would say it's anecdotal, evidence based, like whatever you want to call it. But I also do run into situations, of course, where the pattern might look recognizable, but I start and it doesn't go the way that I think it's going to go. And that's where I might have to look at the science a little bit more. So I'm looking at evidence and patterns, but I'm also always looking at mechanistically what could be happening. Because what I try to explain to people, and this kind of goes with your question, is when we run into these situations, a lot of studies, let's say like if we're like hardcore science based, and you say they look at a study and this causes this, it's like cool. In isolation, yes. In a very complex feedback loop, which is our body, probably not long term, because basically every push has a pull, and there's always going to be some type of reaction to every input. Everything that our body does, we're going to have a defense mechanism. Now, short term, that is awesome, because basically if you took a perfectly healthy person, let's say someone that had pretty decent GI health, pretty good adrenal health, good hormones, whatever, good habits, and let's say that you did everything wrong for a week, whatever, would you feel pretty crappy? For sure. But would you bounce back pretty quick if you just went back to doing the right stuff again? 100%. But what if you did everything wrong for 6 months? Or you did things wrong for a year or 2 years or something like that? Now we're getting into chronic dysfunction, right? So now the feedback loops are not really able to compensate anymore. So that's when things like, you talk about, like, you throw out words like inflammation and people will freak out because they're like, well, you're supposed to have inflammation response to, to injuries and to sickness and things. I'm like, well, yeah, but you're not supposed to have inflammation response that never stops, right? Like, yeah. There's supposed to be, there are other mechanisms that are supposed to control that and modulate it so it doesn't get out of control. Yeah. But why are we seeing things like autoimmune disease, and why are we seeing people with chronic inflammation issues and markers on these labs that basically look like they're, having like heart attacks and shit? Like, they're not, but it happens. So you can't tell me that our body can just like indefinitely protect itself, because it can't. If you continue to give it the wrong inputs over and over and over and over again, eventually you're going to break something in that chain.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, so yeah, I know you have to get going. You have another call, but did you have any like last words or any places people could follow you, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I put out a lot of free information. You guys can, so if you go to my Instagram, Austin St and then the number 8, you can go in the link tree in my bio and have a link to like my YouTube channel. So if you're more into, I don't do any fancy YouTube stuff, so if you're looking for really cool editing, that's not the place for you. However, there is hours and hours and hours of Q&As and whiteboard chats and stuff going over topics, and everything's free. So like, that's a great place to start. I put out free info on Facebook and Instagram. If you want to go further into it, I do have in the link tree, there's a marketplace for all my classes are offered in there. You can contact me. My email's in my bio for any more advanced stuff like mentorship, if you want to talk about more specific application, things like that as well.
Awesome. Cool. Well,
and coaching,
thanks.
obviously.
Yeah. Always. Well, thanks so much for coming on. And that's all. So, all right, guys. Thanks so much for listening. See you next time.